There would have been a lot of stuff like this just piled up on the docks. But you would have also, I think there's an outhouse. That's an outhouse. Guarantee it. That's awesome. All right, we're up to one. I'm gonna do a count of outhouses. We got one. Oh, there's a great well. Go back. There is a brick building here, right where the guy's walking. That was a store. And I don't know if they meant it to be accurate, but that looks pretty accurate. Okay, so this is the neighboring property to Paul Revere's house, which is the Pierce Hitchborn house. I have dug exactly where he's staying, and there is no well there. But there is some really cool 19th century privies. Welcome to Echoes of History. I'm Joe Bagley, city archaeologist and director of archaeology for the city of Boston, and the author of A History of Boston in 50 Artifacts and Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them. Today we're going to do a walking tour of Boston as recreated in the video game Assassin's Creed 3. Starting at the Boston Neck, we'll make our way through the bustling streets to places that were central to key events of the Revolution. From the Boston Tea Party to the Boston Massacre to the Battle of Bunker Hill, we'll see the city as it might have looked in 1783 after the War of Independence had ended. If you enjoyed this video and like to see more like it, don't forget to like and subscribe. That is some serious fortifications. All right, so we're now walking through the gate at the southern tip of Boston. This is the gate that would have separated Roxbury from Boston via a narrow strip of land. I'm going to go out and say that those were not stone. They were definitely going to be wood and earth. But I think the folks would have appreciated it stone. Oh, this is great. We've got birds, the trees. All right, so we are about 150 years out of the settlement of Boston in 1630. So the trees are coming back.
Come see the new summer designs at Miss Bracknell's. Daring bodice cuts and lighter petticoats to keep you roses from wilting.
I love that there's plants growing right on the neck. I think that's one of the things that I think is really cool about Boston in the 1700s. We have a lot of growing plants and gardens in the city. Even during the Revolution, the town was still almost not quite rural, but there were some rural spaces in Chalmette. So we're now a couple years past the Revolution, and we've got some additional lines of forts. People are a little bit nervous still. The accuracy of the architecture is amazing. This is a perfect Georgian house. We haven't quite gotten into the federal style because, well, frankly, we're just trying to figure out what federal style looks like in America. The details are amazing. Even the outbuildings are really detailed. This is great. So the outbuildings being like weathered wood and relatively simple and the kind of lean-to roof like that. This is like spot on. So we see the movement through various layers of fortifications. There was a series of gates and walls before you entered into Boston proper at the southern end of the peninsula. Boston's remarkably small. So just to give folks a reference, Boston is about 790 acres total. The game is about 1/3 of that size, but covering the whole area of Boston. But for reference, Boston is smaller at this time than Central Park. It's about the same size as the Hampstead Heath. I love how immediate we get into the city proper. Boston's so small, it really was like bristling and busting out at the seams by the time you get to 1775. This is 1783. So we're a few years of additional development. Frankly, we're lucky that there's even buildings in 1783, because one of the biggest fears we had was that the British would burn down the entire town on the way out. And that didn't happen, so that's excellent. The overall amount of brick buildings and wooden buildings is really accurate. In 1711, there was a major fire in Boston that burned down a huge chunk of downtown Boston. We're going to get to that area soon. But after that, there was a lot of work that went into making sure that buildings would be rebuilt in brick, to avoid the city going down again, because you can see just how close everything is. I'm also really liking to see people moving, people not moving. We've got women and men. We've got the militias walking around. People are working. I'm really curious to see about the diversity of people on the streets. You have a kid, that's great. There was about 5% black population in 1783. This was a time period when Massachusetts had just made slavery against the Constitution, or agreed that slavery was against the Constitution, which in theory stopped slavery in Massachusetts. It was a little bit of a fade out, but people at this period who are black should be free during the time that's depicted in the game. Oh, there's dogs, the carts. This is a great. One of the things that happened in Charlestown, which is the neighborhood to the north, during the Battle of Bunker Hill, when the entire neighborhood burned down, people fled on carts carried by oxen mostly. So to see the sheer volume of carts in this video game, given that the entire community of 2,000 people had to escape on using carts to get their stuff out of town, is really cool. Pigs on the street. I'm not so sure about that. I know there were pigs in yards. I know even some stories of pigs being in the bottom of privies to eat that's going into outhouses. And I'm actually really hoping to see a privy depicted somewhere in the game. Because I think that's just going to make me happy. So much of what we do is digging up privies, looking for artifact concentrations in them, because they're just amazing data sets of trash from people throwing stuff out in their outhouse. And every one of these places would have had an outhouse behind the building, so I'm going to be keeping my eyes out for that as we go. Signage is amazing. So not everybody could read, and you had a lot of visitors even from other countries, and so the signage was incredibly important to be very visually impactful. So oftentimes stores would have been represented by their name. Like we have a Three Cranes Tavern in Charlestown, so there would have been three birds on the sign itself. So on the left building, just to get kind of nerd out on architecture, that row of bricks between the first and the second story is called a belt course. And it's one of the calling cards of 18th century architecture in Boston that is at least made of brick. And I think the designers did an amazing job capturing the 18th century brick styles, both in the windows, the buildings, the arches over the windows, the flat areas, the lintels over the windows, the belt courses, the row buildings, the mixture of wood and brick. This is a really incredible take on things. This is heading towards the fort, which would have been a pretty big stronghold for the British during this time. Oh, there's a great well. Go back. The topography is really interesting. I think Boston was a little bit less hilly than we're seeing in the video, but not hilly, just a little bit flatter, especially near the waterfront. I think I saw some propaganda posters about the British. Okay, I think this is the New South Meeting House. Looks a little bit more like the 19th century version of the church, which would have been after this one. But they did a really nice job. So one of the things that happened in Boston was we had a lot of, as the population grew, people wanted to walk shorter distances between themselves and where their homes were and the church and the meeting house. And so oftentimes you would get churches being developed north or south of the main church. And so this would be the South Church, but it's the newer of the South churches, so it's the New South Church. At some point we get kind of redundant, so we end up with old New South churches in Boston eventually. The other thing that's really impressive about the churches and the overall topography of the city, if you looked at the city of Boston from the shoreline, each of these churches would have been high-rises. And so you would have seen almost exclusively steeples sticking up from the skyline and the boats, the mast around the city. But overall, the entire city would have been 2-3 stories tall, except for the churches, which stuck up really prominently from the overall landscape. I think this is the market area, although the grass is confusing me. There were marketplaces. One of them was near what would be the State House later, but I don't think we're quite there. I think we're at a different market location. So a lot of these stores are going to have storefronts on the first floor and then housing on the second floor, where oftentimes the person that did the sales in the first floor, whether it be somebody that made things or somebody that sold other products, they would often live and work in the same building. We really don't see people like commuting to work until a bit later, closer to the 19th century, but most people would have lived and worked on the same location. Paul Revere, for example, was a rare instance of a maker who did not live where he actually worked. And so I think we're going to see, hopefully we'll see his house, but he had a home in a different location from where he actually made his silver and pewter. So we're kind of following the southeastern part of the city and moving our way from the southern tip to the kind of outer eastern portion of the city. Boston's kind of shaped like, I think it looks kind of like a moose head, where you have like the large head, a skinny neck, and then two lobes at the top that look kind of like antlers. And so we're kind of like heading towards the chin of the moose. I'm from Maine. I think of things in terms of moose frequently. We're definitely in a market, though. Now, if this had smells, we would regret it, because this would smell a lot like rotting food, although we've got some cooking going on too. So if anyone's been to Haymarket in Boston, we know what the markets smell like. Really ripe vegetables and fruit. I would expect a lot more yelling in the market based on what I see at Haymarket nowadays. I'm not familiar with this church at all. I think it's one of the branches of the churches that ended up adding as we went out from downtown, like the heart of downtown Boston, as the community started to expand and develop around the outskirts of the city. You have a pop-up of all these new churches. So the laundry hanging across the streets, most people were doing laundry in their backyards. So I think we would have probably seen laundry, but you would have seen it in the tiny, tiny backyards, because that's where a lot of people had their pumps and their cisterns that collected water. Because I dug up enough of them to know that's definitely where the laundries were. So the curbs that you're seeing on the edges of all these streets look like they're made of granite, and we don't have a lot of granite showing up in Boston until the 1820s, because that was when quarries in Quincy were used for the granite that was then put into Bunker Hill Monument, and that whole infrastructure to get the granite from the quarry to Boston created this pipeline of granite that can actually move into the city. And so we see a lot of buildings being made out of granite, and the granite curves showing up and the cobblestones showing up, but they don't show up until after that 1825 start. Wow, it's amazing to see the boats. They're so much bigger than everything else on the landscape. I think that would have been one of the most impressive things to see in Boston back in the day. Yeah, I think this is Griffin's Wharf, based on the history that's going on around this time period. So Griffin's Wharf would have been the site of the Tea Party. Today, we're not exactly sure where Griffin's Wharf was. We can kind of reconstruct it based on some of the early maps, but there's now buildings standing almost exactly where Griffin's Wharf was today, so you can't quite go and stand at Griffin's Wharf. There's a hotel there. There's a couple of office buildings. But the Recreation Museum that's there, just outside of where Griffin's Wharf would have been, does a lot of reenactments of the Tea Party. So one of the things that was really commonplace around these wharfs were warehouses. Even more than the buildings that you're seeing, there would have been large, plain wooden buildings that would have more or less stored all the things that you're seeing on the docks. There would have been a lot of stuff like this just piled up on the docks. But you would have also, I think there's an outhouse. That's an outhouse. Guarantee it. That's awesome. All right, we're up to one. I'm gonna do a count of outhouses. We got one. Anyway, the warehouses would have been where things would have been stored prior to going to market. Something's being sold right from the market. When we were doing research on things about enslavement in Boston, we actually found that many of the sales of enslaved people were actually happening not at any one particular marketplace, but in the offices and warehouses of enslavers and slave dealers in enslaved people on the waterfront, who would store people in warehouses, tragically, and then advertise sales at the local taverns to get people to come and see the people that were being offered for sale. Got some massive barrels. Some woodworkers. That's awesome. Curious if they're making the boats, repairing the boats, or if they're actually just making furniture. Boston is making tons of things at this time. The one catch is that their market, which was other Americans and the British, has been cut in half by the lack of trade immediately after the Revolution, as you can imagine, with the British. I'm blown away by the details and the amount of buildings and the amount of things in the road, the animals, the sounds. This is incredible. Wow. So the docks and the piers are really perfect. The dock is the water part. The pier is the part that the guy's walking on right now. Griffin's Wharf would have been the kind of stone and woods areas that you can actually walk along the sides of the boats, but the boats themselves would have been inside the dock. So off in the distance, you can see the Harbor Islands, I think. They're pretty hilly, not quite as hilly here as you see here, but the fog is certainly accurate. It's interesting to see as many military people on the streets. I think I'm really curious how that would have been, because obviously there would have been a lot of tension in '83 following the revolution, and a lot of folks kind of having recently wrapped that up. But I don't know, I would have expected people to be pretty much back to their old ways as far as clothing goes, especially because you remember after 1776, Boston had the evacuation of the British, which meant that as far as in Boston proper, we were kind of done with the American Revolution landscape-wise by 1776, even though the war continued for several years afterwards. We started everything, but we kind of wrapped it up pretty early in the process. But you never know if folks are going to come back. And we're only a few years away from the War of 1812, which was really not great for Boston. We really suffered during that. So it didn't take very long for tensions to rise back up again. So I can imagine there would have been a lot of people, especially in the militias and the early, well, I guess now it's the early Navy and Army, getting ready for potential fighting down the road. There's a rat. We're on the wharfs after all. Those might actually be undersized. Got the early American flag with the colonies. Oh, we're gonna go on a boat. Yeah, the piers are just amazingly rendered. The only boat of this time period I've ever been on is the Constitution, so I'm just trying to remember what it looks like compared. Yeah, that's incredible. So just seeing how once you get to the waterfront, the boats are just such a massive part of the landscape. We're at the South Battery. So the South Battery would have been facing southeast, and that was that kind of stone thing you saw in the middle. That would have been where the cannons that faced in that direction would have been lined up. And so that would have been a much more fortified kind of stone structure. I think that's why we're seeing that kind of edging versus this kind of wooden structure. This feels a little quiet. I feel like we're maybe, I would expect a lot of people on the docks, especially from the workers that would actually be loading and unloading. The merchants would be also walking around, trading, or at least being visible as they go to and from their place of work, or at least their warehouses. I'm pretty sure this is Fort Hill. That's pretty funny. All right, so Fort Hill is on the southeast part of the city, and it would have been one of the earlier fortified places, mostly because it sticks out towards the harbor a little bit more. It makes it a little bit easier to fortify, and it's a hill, which is always a nice thing to fortify. That stone structure is not what we had up there. So Fort Hill would have basically been a couple of cannon, some wooden spike-like structures, which I think I caught a glimpse of, and then maybe a palisade of woods, kind of similar to what we're seeing in the backs of these houses. But that stone structure, nope. Maybe in the 1800s you would have gotten something like that. Wow. Oh, so they did a full-on star fort. This is great. This looks a lot like what you would see in Castle Island today, which is way south of the city. A smaller version of the Castle Island fort, which I think we're going to potentially see that one as well. Oh, they're stone, yeah. This would have probably been more of a glorified fence. Amazing. So if you made everything here out of wood, then I think it would be pretty accurate. So we're going to have places for people to live. So remember that during conflict, people would go into the forts to be able to protect themselves and their families if they were leaders of the military. So you would also have soldiers that would be able to stay inside these forts, but they would be mostly camping. So what we just saw was probably the officers' quarters and the general quarters. Their family may have also been in there. But the everyday soldier would have been literally camping in the front. This isn't a big enough area where the townspeople would have rushed into and have that protection. This is a strictly military thing. Scale-wise, it seems pretty good. I think this is a little bigger than Fort Hill would have been. Definitely a lot more substantial stone structure than would have been there. This would have been a much more like earthen, wooden structure. Muskets, cannonballs. So the cannonballs we have from the Revolution that we've seen are actually pretty small. They're only about 3 inches across. They're heavy as heck, but they're pretty small. These are substantially larger, and I think they would have been more likely to be a little bit smaller, especially from the cannons of that size. Yeah, Fort Hill was a pretty tall hill. I think this might be a little bit tall, but everything looks so much higher when you're on top of it, so I don't want to imply that it's the wrong height. I think they did a really good job showing like the shabbiness of the wharf areas. This place especially, you can really see the wharf with the warehouses. I think that's what we were seeing over there. So I think that was a really great depiction of the warehouses. Haven't quite got the Boston accent yet. People are still pretty British. It's a pretty close to an American accent, actually. Yeah, that's King's Chapel. So there should be a cemetery just to the west area. I can see some graves popping up. So Boston had this thing where the cemeteries are often near churches, but historically the churches and the cemeteries are completely disconnected. So we have King's Chapel Church, or King's Chapel, and then we have the King's Chapel Burying Ground, but they're actually not related to each other. In fact, the burying ground predates King's Chapel. When it was first built in the 1600s, the late 1600s, King's Chapel was Anglican, which was not a well-respected religious flavor in Boston. And so the townspeople forced them to actually take on the corner of the cemetery, which was basically unused land and unwanted land. So they built their original church, a wooden church, in the cemetery. And then once the actual congregation got big enough, they built what you're seeing here, the stone church with the wooden columns, around the original wooden church, and then pulled the actual wooden church out of of the inside of the church through the windows piece by piece. And eventually they sold that disassembled church, and it was moved up to Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, which is St. John's Chapel today. And that ended up burning, unfortunately, in 2001 on Halloween night. All right, so we're going down School Street. We should be seeing the Boston Latin School around here, but I'm not seeing it on the landscape. There's a pretty big hill here, but the hill's actually on the road itself. In fact, we had a complaint from one of the Huguenot kings, one of the king's people that they brought into the town around the Revolution, who was a Huguenot, was complaining about kids sledding down School Street. And so he went out and threw ashes on the road, and the kids actually got really mad and went to the guy's house and had basically a little summit with the Huguenot leader. The Huguenot leader fed the kids a bunch of wine, and they all came to apparently a accord and moved on with life. But a little kind of early diplomacy between children and Huguenot British leaders. Yeah, that's Old South. Awesome. Okay, so now we're heading down what's now called Washington Street. They hadn't gotten around to naming it that after the Revolution, but this would have been... That road had a whole bunch of names over time, but I think in this area it would have been Marlborough, possibly Newbury, or possibly Cornhill, depending on what stretch of the road you were on at the time. At first glance, I thought we saw a power line crossing the street. Then I realized that probably wasn't happening in 1783. So this church was built in 1723. So by the time the game is happening, we've already got 40, 50 years of use. It's interesting because if you see the door on the right, that's actually the front of the church. You kind of enter in from the side. So the meeting house style is to actually have a wider kind of congregation. This area was really misused by the British during the siege of Boston, and so part of the reason was because the Tea Party in 1773 started from here after a massive rally. 7,000 people marched from this church to Griffin's Wharf, which is where we were earlier, to throw the tea into the harbor, or really into one of the small ports. But part of the punishment for using Old South was they cleared out the floors and actually used it as a horse kind of training ground for the British, like a riding center. This is the old Corner Bookstore. Look at that. All right, one of the things they really nailed here. So the old Corner Bookstore is a really old building. 17, I think it's like 13 or so. They didn't add the buildings that are currently behind it until a few years later, and I think it's really impressive that they are missing a couple buildings down the back. Interestingly, the roads are a little bit misaligned because that's actually School Street, which we've already walked down, but they nailed the use of the building. Oh, and they got the Cunningham House next to it. So there's two buildings that abut from the early 1700s, the old Corner Bookstore and the Cunningham House, and they're two of like the only abutting 1700s buildings that survive in Boston, and they got both of them in, which was really exciting. But the bookstore was an apothecary. Thomas Creese, who actually made it into a bookstore much later in the 1800s, that's what it's known for today, but it's not a bookstore at the time. Interestingly, the old Corner Bookstore was the home of Anne Hutchinson, who was one of the folks that were kicked out of Boston during what's called the Antinomian Crisis, which is just basically the wrong flavor of Puritanism. But Anne Hutchinson's home was at the site of Old Corner Bookstore, and she held outdoor gatherings of women in Boston, preaching to them. So it's a site of some of the early women's preaching that happened. Didn't go so well for her. She was kicked out pretty abruptly for doing that, which is a very common thing happening in Boston. old brick. Wow. So this is the old brick church. So this was the site of the first church in Boston, the official first church, which was started in 1632. Old brick was made a little bit later and torn down in the early 1800s. This is right by the old State House, which is now coming up. Incredible. Both of these buildings had earlier versions from the 1600s, but in 1711, a major fire took out the entire downtown portion of Boston and got rebuilt. So this is the State House replacing the original townhouse, this is the State House during this time period when Massachusetts was actually becoming a state. Earlier, it was the townhouse, which would have been the seat of the colonial governor and the judicial and legislative branches. Not on this end of the building, but on the other end, which we might see, there's a lion and the unicorn, which represents the British crown. Those were torn down and burned ahead of the revolution. Oh, we still have them. Okay. Wow, that's interesting. So you can see the unicorn in the background representing Scotland. That wasn't there. So got a little bit of a miss there. But and they would not have put them up immediately in the 1780s. That was still a little too soon for the folks there. So today the old State House is run by the Revolutionary Spaces organization as a museum, and it's beautifully restored. But underneath it is a subway station, and it's one of the places I really wish we could have dug, but the subway station came in pretty early and kind of messed up the ground around it. But as an archaeologist, that would have been a really interesting place to do archaeology. So we're coming up on the Boston Massacre site, which is right on the right. That was the site of the Boston Massacre in 1770 in March. Today there's a star on the brick showing the site location. All right, we got the lion and the unicorn. And then today there's a clock, but at this time there would have been a sundial at the top of the gable. And I'm looking and seeing, looks like they got the gable. The stairs were there, they're not there today. And that balcony would have been the place where the Declaration of Independence was read for the first time in Boston. And that's now done annually. This is State Street today. At the time, it would have been called King Street. So on the left, I think we're seeing the home of Charles Apthorp. There's a painting from like 1805 that depicts this entire area, and I think they're capturing each of those buildings, which is really cool. I wish I could kind of run around a little bit longer. But Charles Apthorp, like Peter Faneuil, were incredibly wealthy guys who made a huge amount of money trading in humans in the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. So that was one of the places that, one of the homes of a really wealthy merchant. We actually have from Faneuil Hall an artifact that has Thomas Apthorp's name on it. It's a wizard, which is like a toy. That was one of Charles Apthorp's sons. And this household would have had, I think, 5 enslaved people, including an enslaved boy. And so thinking about that house where you have Thomas Apthorp, who would have not been a young boy hitting up people for money on the streets, but an enslaved boy who we don't know much else about, living in that same home, to have like the two different types of wealth and privilege represented in the same household. All right, so now we're heading out to Long Wharf. Long Wharf is about a third of a mile long, and it went way out into the harbor. An incredibly important piece of the economics of Boston. This was built just to be able to bring in even more ships than was available to Boston at the time before, which was through the town dock, which is where Faneuil Hall is. And I think we're heading to town dock soon, just based on where we are. There's the "Don't Tread on Me" sign, one of the early protest signs. This is a bustling wharf, and I think they're really nailing it from like the overall volume of people. We've got the warehouses, we got a lot of people. I think there would have been a lot more dock workers and ship workers, although we're looking like we're getting a little bit of conflict going on. This would have been where you would have seen a lot of diversity in Boston. You would have seen a lot of people from other parts of the world coming in and trading. You also would have seen a lot of sailors who would have been, at this time, predominantly white, but there would have been quite a few black sailors. Just before then, there would have been a lot of enslaved sailors, but also freed black sailors now in 1783, but anybody coming up from the south could have still been enslaved.
In today's one-penny Boston Country Journal.
So somewhere around here is one of the houses that would have been used by John Hancock. Hancock's counting house is brick, so I haven't seen a brick building depicted here, but it would have been around in 1783. I might have missed it. That today is the Chart House restaurant or Chart House building. So you should be able to see off the tip of the Long Wharf, East Boston, and then to the right you'd see some of the islands off in the distance. They were smart to put the fog just to kind of help keep the renderings down a little bit. There's a really great engraving that Paul Revere made in 1768 that depicts Long Wharf right around the time of the British arrival, and so you can actually see troops on the dock. But it's a view from the ocean looking towards Boston with the entire length of Long Wharf really prominent in it, and it really gives you a sense of just how prominent the wharf would have been in Boston. See Fort Hill off in the distance. One of the windiest places in Boston. So folks that have been to Faneuil Hall, you're going to notice a difference between what you're seeing here and what it looks like today. So originally Faneuil Hall was 2 stories and only about half as wide as it is today. In the late 1700s, there was a fire, and when it was rebuilt, they basically expanded on the building to make it significantly bigger. So what you see here is 3 arches wide. The building today is 5 arches wide. That was built using funds given to the city by Peter Faneuil, who also got most of his money through, well, not most, but a sizable amount of his money through the selling of enslaved people. When they built the building with his money after he died, it was not a popular place because this was meant to be like the centralized market for the town of Boston, but all of those merchants that you see throughout the game selling their wares in marketplaces and other things didn't necessarily want one big market. They really wanted to be able to control their own space, and so there was actually riots over the idea of this like quote-unquote big box store coming in and taking away all the business of their kind of mom and pop shops. So this is a very controversial place at the time and before it was built. And it's still a pretty controversial place today. This is basically looking at City Hall today as we're walking out. of the western part of Faneuil Hall. You'd be looking directly at the back of City Hall, at the mayor's chambers and city council chambers. So as a marketplace, you would have had these corrals in various places to actually buy and sell animals. One of the kind of big questions that is kind of floating around in Boston research is, was this a place of a slave market? And we have been able to track down about 2 or 3 dozen places recorded as being places where enslaved people were bought and sold. And so far, we haven't found any evidence that there was a market of any kind in Faneuil Hall or at Faneuil Hall. But Town Dock, which is just to the right of this, what you're seeing here, would have been the site of many of the ships that would have come in. And the surrounding area, which has a lot of taverns and warehouses, are definitely recorded as having enslaved people. But we don't have a centralized marketplace or slave market like you'd see in other towns. There should be taverns everywhere. So taverns are places where you could get drinks, but you could also rent a room. So they're kind of like meeting rooms. They're kind of a combination of a hotel, a bar, and a meeting room rental spot. But they're also kind of like the main place where plans are made, where, you know, revolutions are plotted. And they played a major role in Boston's history. And there was tons of them around the docks because you had people needing to meet with each other. Also many people getting off the ship with money to spend. And it was a very popular place to have a tavern. There was quite a few tavern licenses. There would have been a bunch of different kinds, and they would have catered to different audiences. You would have had kind of like an expensive tavern where folks would have paid a little bit more to have nicer food. And then you had poorer taverns that would have catered more towards like the sailors that came off the boats. So we're walking up Ann Street or North Street, depending on the time period, which is going to be warehouses on the left, ships on the right. Oh, this is the drawbridge. I was hoping they would show this. Okay, so this is a bridge that crosses over downtown Boston to the north end. Town Dock is on your right. That's now filled in. And then we're essentially now in the north end. So if you're in Boston today, we are now crossing across the Greenway, which used to be the highway, and now it's this beautiful park that snakes through Boston. I'm here as a city archaeologist because of archaeology that happened right where this guy's walking now, for the big dig that turned that highway into a tunnel. So there's on the left the John Carnes site and the Catherine Nandy Naylor site. Actually, John Carnes may be living at this time period, and those two archaeological sites I curate now, and are part of the reasons why I'm here, and supposedly would be underground in this image. So this looming booms of ships, I think, is something that really striking to see over the streets. If you were at City Hall in this time period, you would have actually had boats almost touching City Hall in Boston from Town Dock. And today you wouldn't even notice that you were close to the ocean. I recognize that color paint. All right, now we are on Ann Street or North Street. Yep, that's Paul Revere's house. It looks just like it does today. That's great. Second oldest house in Boston, built in the 1680s. The site of John and Cotton Mather, the famous Boston judges, preachers. Everybody was everything back then. Oh, yeah, nice well. I dug on that exact spot. Okay, so this is the neighboring property to Paul Revere's house, which is the Pierce Hitchborn house. I have dug exactly where he's staying, and there is no well there. But there is some really cool 19th century privies. Okay, now we're in the backyard of the Paul Revere house. Just to the left, in about 100 years, there's going to be an outhouse. This is the home of Paul Revere. So he lived here in the 1780s, sold the house in 1800, and lived there with like 12 kids in that relatively tiny house. I don't know what they were thinking getting a house that small. So the house is over 100 years old. at the time that he bought it. Really old house, really small house, and you can see that there's really no room for a silversmith shop. Paul Revere's outhouse, which we really wish we could have found, is now underneath Modern Pastry, for those of you who've been to Boston and know the landscape of our Italian pastries. An incredibly important bakery, and unfortunately a Wizard of Oz onto our really historic site well before the bakery, but in the 1800s when they built the buildings. Okay, this is the second church, which was the second church made, big shock. The first church was old brick, which we saw over by the State House. So this is the second church, which was built as the community moved a little bit further north, didn't want to walk the 5 minutes to old brick. The north end is kind of like a peninsula, so it's a little bit out of downtown, and it kind of became its own it is its own neighborhood. But the Revere house should be like right in the background here. So they separated out the space a little bit. But today this is Rachel Revere Park, which is just outside of Old North, a beautiful little park from the city of Boston. One pretty important thing about this building, it was torn down by the British while they were occupying Boston in the 1700s and then used as firewood. So that building isn't there. I'm not even sure if it was brick or wood at the time, but either way, there is absolutely no church at that moment. So got a little bit of a zombie church, but it's cool to see it either way. There are drawings of it, so we know what it looked like. So they did a good job recreating it, but 1783, it wasn't there. We're in the wandering streets of the North End. So this area is a pretty, not quite gridded, but it's a little bit more longer streets. Don't have quite the wandering paths that you would see downtown. There's Old North in the background. It was built in 1723. Oh, I think we're walking through what today is the Paul Revere Mall, which is like a narrow park that goes to the back of Old North. We should also be seeing the Clough House or the Clough House pretty soon if we go up and take a left a little bit. There's an early brick house that I dug in the backyard of. But this mixture of styles of row buildings and Georgian homes with the gambrel roof, spot on. All right, now we're heading on to the back of Old North. Okay. So just to the right, I did a dig in a few years ago on a 19th century site and found an incredible privy full of things from the 1840s, but that hasn't happened yet in the video game, so we'll excuse them for not showing it. But this area is really densely occupied. There is a brick building here, right where the guy's walking, that was a store. And I don't know if they meant it to be accurate, but that looks pretty accurate. Old North with propaganda on the side. So Old North Church is famous for being the site of the lanterns that were hung during the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. So 1775, 1F by land, 2F by sea. So Robert Newen, the sexton who lived behind the church, broke a window on the back of the church and climbed the stairs to the top of the church, where he lit two lights to signify that the British were were departing by sea. And so the British actually crossed Boston Common and landed in a town just northwest of here called Watertown, and then marched to Lexington and Concord during the very, very beginning of the American Revolution. So this is Copp's Hill Burying Ground. Ooh, they made it very small. It's one of the earliest cemeteries in Boston, and this would be the battery at the end of Copp's Hill. So this is the spot where the British troops actually, on these cannons, fired towards Charlestown, which is just off the map to the right. During the Battle of Bunker Hill, they fired incendiary shots, which are basically heated cannonballs, and when they landed, they caught fire to whatever they sat up against. And so we actually have the entire town burned, and part of that was from the firing that happened from Copp's Hill. I got a call from a utility excavator on the road that he's crossing right now. That was, they were digging a trench next to this, the same road that the Copp's Hill Burying Ground is on, and they found a gravestone. And we were all terrified that they had accidentally found a grave that was just outside of the walls of the burying ground. So we rushed out there. It was January. It was horrible weather. But it turned out that they had found a drain. And so back in the day, the folks around here who were trying to manage water from this is Turkey. Wow, that is surprisingly accurate. Not necessarily for downtown, but for my neighborhood and Mattapan and many other places in Boston. Avoiding turkeys is an active challenge, and I know that's an inside joke from the designers at MIT. So anyway, the drain that the excavators found was actually crossing the street, and they would make these brick drains to channel water through the city. And unfortunately, gravestones were the perfect size and shape to put lids on top of these drains. And so they literally plucked some poor kid named Sarah Baker's gravestone, probably from Copp's Hill, and then put it underground as a lid on top of this drain. And there were other slate stones that we couldn't see from the edges of the, that we could see but couldn't get to on the edges of the excavations that were probably other people's gravestones. So unfortunately, the reverence that we have today about gravestones and graves and burial grounds is far from what happened back in the day. Folks were not expecting to be left completely alone. Gravestones were a little bit more movable, and they would reuse children's gravestones to make a drain, unfortunately. But fortunately for us, we did not find Sarah Baker herself, and the stone has now been sent back. And her mom's actually in the graveyard, so we were able to put her back with her mom.
Invite you to see the season's beauties in their market-side shop.
In the 19th century, there was a bunch of brothels on Endicott Street, also on Ann Street, which is where Paul Revere's house is. And during the Big Dig, they came across the outhouse of one of the brothels, and an incredibly interesting set of artifacts came out of that for another time. But this area has evolved over time. We've seen a lot of right angles on these roads, and I think to design the map, I can imagine why they had to do it, but there's very few streets that have right turns in Boston just because of the old native trails that were created. There's a misconception about our roads as being laid out on cow paths, but the reality is the cows weren't around long enough to make a path by the time the road started, so most of our winding streets are native paths going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. The Massachusetts people that were here walking along the natural trails, the natural landscapes going around hills and things like that, created original pathways that were then turned into a formal road by the colonists when they arrived. And that's why we have such winding streets in Boston, is that we have very ancient roads. All right, so now we're crossing back over what's called Scutto's Wharf, looking back towards what's now Faneuil Hall to the drawbridge, although it doesn't look like a drawbridge from that angle. Now we're heading into, this is Hanover Street, but the western end of Hanover, which is closer now to Government Center, which is like the middle of Boston, kind of close to to City Hall.
If there's anything you need that I don't have, I'll find it for you.
I'm really curious about all the flags. There's quite a few being flown, and I'm wondering if that would have been very prevalent. I know there's a lot of folks that come to the U.S. and are surprised by how many flags are being flown generally, and so I'm curious if that was something that kicked off immediately after the Revolution, or if it was something that kind of happened more towards the present. But obviously the ships would have had flags on them to show origins, but there's quite a few flags on the landscape here. Wow, this view is practically out of a Dickens novel. We're kind of close to the West End, which is kind of the back of Beacon Hill, which is the one of the last places to get developed actually in Boston. It was a place to put a beacon on the top of to signify out to the surrounding area. I was wondering where all these carts were around, but then I remembered that in the game you actually can jump into them to hide from the people going around trying to find you, and so it makes more sense why there's all these like hay carts everywhere, corn husk carts. The lady walking by looking up was probably an early tourist. I think we're using some standard church designs to spread out the different types of buildings here, and I'm seeing a hill in the background, so I think we're a lot closer to Beacon Hill. I think. I don't know the church in this area. Today there's the Old West Church, but I don't know if there was one there at the time. The chickens are great. Those pomegranates? Maybe they're onions. That makes more sense. Would have been a lot of ruts in the road from the wagons going back and forth. I don't think there'd be a lot of grass growing. So there's a really early drawing of Beacon Hill that shows these kind of stepped walls in it, and I think this is where we're getting some of the inspiration for the imagery here. Yeah, we're definitely on the back of Beacon Hill. So this looks like the north slope of Beacon Hill. This would have been an early free black community back in the day as it was developed, but not until actually right around this time. It would have been between like 83 and like the early 1800s. We would have had this area start to get developed. This is kind of, as you can tell, the back of beyond as far as downtown Boston goes, and so unfortunately it was the place where folks of lower income were able to put their homes, and so this became one of the early free black communities in the city. I'm kind of curious if that'll be represented visually. Today, Beacon Hill is like the wealthiest neighborhood in Boston, maybe in all of New England, with a lot of brick row houses. At this time, it would have been pretty sparsely occupied. The other side of the hill had John Copley's house and some rope walks and John Hancock's house, but this area was definitely like the back part. There were some docks back here in the end of the mill pond, which should be just off to the right. Gosh, so many churches to remember in Boston. I'm not even sure which ones are being depicted anymore. They're everywhere. The hills in the background are definitely too tall, but we do have the hills. The Blue Hills south of Boston are really important today, but also to the ancient Native community.
If you're not entirely satisfied, I'll return.
What is happening in the front of that church? We've done digs around some of these colonial churches, and I can tell you right now, people do not leave anything around churches. We know it's one of the biggest places for people to be, as you can see there, depicted of people just milling about, and obviously people would have been going to church and talking after Mass and before, but man, there's nothing in the ground around them, and it's really frustrating to do archaeology, because it's almost like you can tell it's a church because you didn't find anything. Curious about this drum. Must be one of the training militias. So there's the beacon. So it's a cauldron that would be filled with tar, and you would light it. It's really just to warn folks of an attack and any major thing that's happening in the city. It's been there at this point for about 140 years. By the 1780s. The British took it down. It got rebuilt pretty quickly afterwards because, it's basically a pot on a stick, so it didn't take too long to put it back up there. This is now the site of the Massachusetts State House. So if you go there today, there's a recreation of the beacon just to the north of the State House. But in order to put the State House there, this whole hill had to be cut down about 58 feet. Of just taking everything you see basically to the left of the guy was taken down and used in part to fill in Back Bay, at least portions of Back Bay, which is today a big neighborhood, a really fancy Victorian neighborhood of row houses and buildings and restaurants and shops. But the dirt that makes that up is quite a bit of it is made up of fill from Beacon Hill and other towns. We have quite a few drawings of the beacon, so this is a spot-on reconstruction. I love the path. I did a digital reconstruction using Photoshop images. Believe it or not, this is a better version of this hill, and I put a path in it, and I think we were thinking the same thing. Looks pretty similar. This is a glacial moraine, basically, so it would have been dumping just all kinds of dirt and rock and soils on top of the hill. So the natural landscape of Beacon Hill, the Common, that whole area would have been kind of rolling hills like you see here, though this is the biggest of the three, and then big boulders kicking out of the ground. That's amazing. So Boston Common would have been a really important place at this time. So it's one of the only open spaces. It was the cow common for the residents of Boston. You could have a cow on the common or 5 sheep, and there was one guy that got to keep a horse. But it was called the Common because it was kind of commonly owned by the adult white men of the town, who were afforded the right to have a cow on the Common. Today it's the massive park that the city is well known for. But it didn't become officially a park until the 1800s, but it was always kind of publicly owned open space park-like before that. But it was really a Victorian thing to turn it into a formal park with like pathways, and people could walk around in their finest and show off what they had. And fortunately, they dropped tons of stuff because we've done archaeology all over Boston Common. and people have been dropping stuff on the common for 5,500 years or more. What we didn't find were the burials of folks that were hanged on the common, since it was one of the biggest hanging areas of the whole colony. Really, there would have been a tree that people were hanged on there. So I think we're in Castle Island. The structure looks more like the current fort, which is Fort Independence, which is from the 1800s. That's where Edgar Allan Poe was stationed, and it's a big star fort with like granite walls and everything like that. At the time, it would have been more like what we saw inside of Fort Hill, which was just kind of like a large building for officers, and then a wall around that and some other kind of support structures. But more or less, it would have been a fortified camp and less of a fort that you see today. That's the powder house in the background, that kind of dome top thing. So that is where all the gunpowder would have been stored by the colonists before and during the Revolution. It was really quickly occupied and taken so that they couldn't use it. So this fort was actually a pretty far distance from the city downtown. You can see it in the distance, but it's not right there. This was an island that would have had a fort going back to the 1630s. It was known as Castle William. At this time, it would have been rebuilt as Fort Adams, which you would have seen here. The British didn't want to leave anything for the colonists to get after they left on evacuation day, so they basically destroyed the fort on their way out. It's an incredible reconstruction of Boston. I think the capturing of humanity and the capture of movements of people and the landscape of Boston is beautifully accurate and well depicted. And so I'm going to be thinking a lot about those visuals when I'm doing my digs. I'm actually like leaving to go to a dig from this time period, and I'm going to be envisioning what this landscape looked like on my dig today. It's a really powerful, useful take on Boston, and frankly accurate. I didn't see any, besides like a building that wasn't supposed to be there, and maybe some layout changes that were different from like the actual map of Boston. It's an incredibly accurate depiction of Boston. A real treat. Thanks for joining me as I looked at the recreation of revolutionary Boston in Assassin's Creed 3. You can go deeper into the history that inspires the Assassin's Creed games by watching interviews with historical experts on Echoes of History.